He refused to move. Even when the elderly man stood there, leaning heavily on his cane, struggling to balance on one prosthetic leg while passengers squeezed past him in the narrow aisle. Even when the flight attendant asked politely, then more firmly. Even when other passengers started staring, whispering, shaking their heads in disgust. "I paid for this seat," the businessman sneered, not even looking up from his laptop. "First class, seat 2A. This old man can figure out his own problems." But what he didn't know, what none of the passengers crammed into that Boeing 737 understood, was that the frail man struggling to stay upright had once carried wounded soldiers through enemy fire for 3 straight days without rest. And the pilot's voice that had just welcomed everyone aboard? That belonged to someone who owed everything he had to the man now being humiliated in the aisle. In 12 minutes, when the flight attendant finally whispered 6 words into the businessman's ear, his face would turn white as snow. He would gather his belongings with trembling hands and practically run toward the back of the plane. But by then, everyone on Flight 447 would have learned something they'd never forget about assuming they know who matters and who doesn't. Welcome to the Veteran's Voice, where we uncover the truth behind moments that change everything. Before we continue with this powerful story that happened just last month on a flight from Denver to Phoenix, tell us in the comments from which city in the world are you watching this video today. And if you believe stories like this deserve to be heard, please hit that subscribe button to support our growing community. We're sharing these important stories every week, and your support means everything to us. Flight 447 was supposed to be routine. A Tuesday morning departure from Denver International, half empty despite the holiday weekend approaching. The kind of flight where passengers spread out, flight attendants had time to chat, and the captain might even come back to say hello to frequent flyers. In first class, only 4 seats were occupied. 2 business travelers typing frantically on their phones, a young woman reading a paperback novel, and Marcus Chin, a corporate consultant who flew first class everywhere because, as he often told people, image was everything in his business. He'd upgraded his seat the night before, paying extra for 2A specifically because it had the most legroom and was closest to the exit. Everything calculated, everything planned. Marcus had built his reputation on being untouchable. At 38, he ran a consulting firm that specialized in corporate restructuring, which usually meant firing people in the most efficient way possible. He wore his ruthlessness like a badge of honor, often joking that empathy was a luxury his clients couldn't afford. His assistant had booked him on this flight to Phoenix for a presentation that would likely result in 300 layoffs, and he'd spent the morning reviewing termination strategies over his usual breakfast of black coffee and ambition. The elderly man who entered the plane 20 minutes before takeoff moved slowly, deliberately. His name was Samuel Rivers, though no one on the plane knew that yet. What they could see was a man in his late 70s, wearing a faded brown jacket that had seen better decades, carrying a small canvas bag that looked like it might have been military issue once upon a time. His left leg moved stiffly, and he leaned heavily on a wooden cane that was clearly not just for show. Samuel paused at the entrance to first class, checking his boarding pass twice. Seat 2B, right next to the businessman who hadn't looked up once since boarding. The flight attendant, Sarah Martinez, noticed him struggling and immediately stepped forward to help. "Let me take that bag for you, sir," she offered, her voice warm and professional. Samuel nodded gratefully, handing over his bag while carefully maneuvering into the narrow space between the seats. The prosthetic leg beneath his khaki pants made every movement deliberate, each step requiring balance and planning. Marcus glanced up briefly, saw the elderly man's difficulty, and immediately returned to his screen without offering to help or even acknowledging his presence. Sarah watched this interaction with growing discomfort. She'd been flying for 12 years, had seen every kind of passenger behavior imaginable, but something about the businessman's complete indifference struck her as particularly cold. Still, she maintained her professional demeanor and helped Samuel settle into his seat. "Can I get you anything before takeoff, sir? Extra pillow? Something to drink?" "No thank you, miss. I'm fine." Samuel's voice was quiet but steady, with just the hint of a southern accent that suggested roots somewhere far from Colorado. Marcus finally acknowledged his seammate with a quick glance and an almost imperceptible shake of his head. To him, Samuel looked like every other elderly passenger who probably shouldn't be traveling alone, taking up space that belonged to people with actual important places to be. He turned his body slightly toward the window, creating a wall of expensive suit fabric between himself and the old man beside him. What Marcus couldn't see, what none of the passengers boarding Flight 447 could know, was that Samuel Rivers was traveling to Phoenix for the first time in 15 years. His son lived there now, had lived there since taking a job that required him to be away more than home, working schedules that made family visits nearly impossible. But this week was different. This week marked something special, something that had taken months of careful planning and coordination to arrange. Sarah continued her pre-flight preparations, greeting passengers, checking boarding passes, helping people stow carry-on bags. But her attention kept drifting back to the mismatched pair in the first row. The businessman, now on a phone call speaking loudly about profit margins and cost-cutting measures. The elderly veteran, sitting quietly with his hands folded, looking out the small window at the ground crew loading luggage. She didn't know yet that before this flight was over, she would witness something that would restore her faith in human decency. She didn't know that the quiet old man beside the rude businessman was about to teach everyone on that plane a lesson about respect, sacrifice, and the price of assumptions. She just knew that something felt different about this flight. Something important was about to happen. 20 minutes after takeoff, Samuel began to shift uncomfortably in his seat. The narrow first-class chair, despite being wider than economy, wasn't designed for someone with his particular challenges. His prosthetic leg needed to be positioned at a specific angle to avoid pressure sores, and the fixed armrest was creating problems he hadn't anticipated. He tried adjusting quietly, not wanting to disturb anyone. A slight lean to the right, then to the left, an attempt to stretch his good leg into the aisle. But every movement seemed to require him to bump against Marcus's armrest or briefly enter his space. Marcus's typing became more aggressive, his sighs more pronounced. Finally, he turned to Samuel with barely concealed irritation. "Look, I don't know what your situation is, but I paid extra for this seat specifically for the space. I've got work to do, and I need to be able to concentrate." Samuel looked at him quietly for a moment. "I apologize. I'm trying to find a comfortable position. This leg of mine doesn't bend the way it used to." "That's not really my problem," Marcus replied, already turning back to his laptop. "Maybe you should have booked a seat that worked better for your limitations." Other passengers were beginning to notice. The woman across the aisle looked up from her book with obvious disapproval. One of the business travelers 2 rows back had stopped typing to watch the interaction. But no one said anything yet. Air travel had trained people to mind their own business, to avoid confrontation at 30,000 feet. Samuel continued to struggle silently. He'd flown before, of course, but always in economy where the expectations were different and the spaces more forgiving somehow. This had been a gift, an upgrade he hadn't asked for but had accepted gratefully when the airline agent mentioned it during check-in. Now he wondered if he should have declined, should have stayed in the back where his discomfort wouldn't inconvenience someone so obviously important. Sarah had been watching from the galley, growing more concerned by the minute. She'd seen plenty of difficult passengers in her career, but Marcus's behavior was crossing lines that went beyond mere rudeness. When she saw Samuel try to massage circulation back into his leg while Marcus pointedly turned his body even further away, she decided to intervene. "Sir," she addressed Marcus politely, "I notice your neighbor is having some difficulty getting comfortable. First-class seats can sometimes be adjusted. Would you mind if I showed him how to modify the positioning?" Marcus looked up with the expression of someone being asked to donate a kidney. "Actually, I would mind. I'm in the middle of preparing for a very important presentation, and I need this space to work." He has his own seat. He can figure out how to use it. "Sir, the gentleman appears to have a medical condition which is unfortunate for him, but not my responsibility." Marcus's voice was getting louder, attracting attention from passengers throughout the cabin. "I paid for first class to avoid exactly this kind of situation. If he can't handle first-class seating, maybe he belongs in economy." The cabin fell silent except for the steady hum of engines. Sarah felt her professional composure being tested in ways her training hadn't fully prepared her for. Other passengers were staring now, some pulling out phones, others shaking their heads in obvious disgust. Samuel, meanwhile, had gone very still. His hands rested on his lap, and he was looking straight ahead with an expression that was difficult to read. Not angry, exactly. Not hurt, exactly. Something deeper, sadder, more resigned. Like a man who had encountered this kind of treatment before and had learned not to expect better. "I don't want to cause any trouble," he said quietly to Sarah. "Maybe I could move to an empty seat in the back? I noticed there were several available when I boarded." "Absolutely not," Sarah replied, her professional mask beginning to slip. "You have every right to the seat you were assigned. No one is moving anywhere." Marcus slammed his laptop shut. "Are you kidding me? Now I can't even work because of this drama? This is exactly why I avoid commercial flights when possible. The complete lack of consideration for paying customers. He stood up abruptly, looming over Samuel in a display that looked almost threatening. Look, old man, I don't know what kind of game you're playing here, but I suggest you figure out how to sit in your seat without bothering everyone else, or find somewhere else to sit. Some of us have real work to do. That's when Sarah noticed something she hadn't seen before. Other passengers weren't just watching anymore. They were getting angry. The woman with the paperback had put her book down entirely and was staring at Marcus with undisguised contempt. One of the business travelers had started to stand, as if preparing to say something. Even passengers from economy were craning their necks to see what was happening in first class. But it was the expression on Samuel's face that stopped her cold. For just a moment, she saw something flash across his features. Not fear, not embarrassment, not even anger. Something that looked almost like recognition. Like he had been in situations far more serious than this, had faced down threats far more dangerous than an arrogant businessman having a tantrum. Then the expression was gone, replaced by that same quiet dignity that had marked every interaction since he'd boarded. Sarah made a decision that would change everything. She walked quickly toward the cockpit, her mind racing. There was something about this situation that went beyond a simple seat dispute. Something about the elderly man's quiet strength, his military bearing, the way he carried himself despite his obvious physical challenges. She needed to talk to Captain Rivers. Sarah knocked softly on the cockpit door, waiting for the electronic lock to disengage. Captain James Rivers looked up from his pre-flight checklist, his expression shifting to concern when he saw her face. "What's going on out there, Sarah?" I heard raised voices. "We have a situation in first class. A passenger is refusing to allow his seatmate to get comfortable, and the seatmate appears to have some kind of prosthetic leg issue. The businessman is being—" She paused, searching for professional language, extremely difficult. James set down his clipboard. "What's the passenger's name? The one having trouble?" Sarah checked her passenger manifest. "Samuel Rivers. Elderly gentleman, maybe late 70s. Very quiet, very polite. Traveling alone." The color drained from Captain Rivers' face. He stared at the manifest for a long moment, then looked up at Sarah with an expression she'd never seen before. Wonder, disbelief, and something that looked almost like panic. "Did you say Samuel Rivers?" "Yes, sir." "Do you know him?" James was already unbuckling his seatbelt, standing up with sudden urgency. "Know him?" "Sarah, that's my father." The words hung in the air of the small cockpit like something impossible, something that didn't make sense with what she'd just witnessed in the cabin. "Your father?" But he didn't. "I mean, when I asked if he needed anything, he didn't mention." "He wouldn't," James said, his voice thick with emotion. "He never mentions who he is, never asks for special treatment." "Sarah, my father hasn't flown to see me in 15 years. He says it's too expensive, too much trouble. I've been trying to get him to visit for years." He paused, running his hands through his hair, trying to process what this meant. "Wait, today is Tuesday, November 23rd. That means—" His eyes widened with realization. "His 80th birthday is Thursday. He's surprising me. He actually flew out here to surprise me for his birthday." Sarah felt something shift in her chest, a weight of understanding that made her previous anger at Marcus pale in comparison to what she was feeling now. "Captain, there's something else you should know. The businessman, he's been incredibly rude to your father. Told him he belongs in economy. Refused to let me help him get comfortable. Made it clear he thinks your father is just some inconvenient old man taking up space." James's expression hardened. "What's this passenger's name?" "Marcuston. Seat 2A. And my father didn't say anything? Didn't defend himself?" "No, sir. He apologized for causing trouble and offered to move to the back of the plane." James closed his eyes for a moment, and Sarah could see him struggling with something bigger than just anger at a rude passenger. "Sarah, you need to understand something about my father. He's not just any veteran. Colonel Samuel Rivers. 3 tours in Vietnam, 2 in Afghanistan. He lost that leg-pulling wounded soldiers out of a burning transport in Kandahar when he was 58 years old. He should have retired years earlier, but he kept re-enlisting because he said his experience could save lives." He turned to look out the cockpit window, his voice dropping to something that was almost a whisper. "He came home with 17 medals, including 2 Purple Hearts and a Distinguished Service Cross. The leg was the least of his injuries. He spent 2 years learning to walk again, learning to live again. And he's never once, not once in all the years since, used his service or his sacrifices to ask for anything from anyone." Sarah felt tears beginning to form. "Captain, what do you want me to do?" James stood silent for a long moment, clearly wrestling with competing emotions. Professional protocol, personal feelings, and something deeper that she couldn't quite identify. I want to go back there and tell that businessman exactly who he's talking to. I want to explain to him that the inconvenient old man he's bullying is worth more than he'll ever be. But I know my father. He'd be mortified if I made a scene, if I used my position to fight his battles. He looked at Sarah with sudden clarity. But maybe there's another way. Maybe you could have a quiet word with Mr. Chin. Help him understand that he might want to reconsider his behavior. Sarah nodded, understanding immediately what he was asking. What exactly should I tell him? Tell him, James said, his voice gaining strength, that the elderly gentleman he's been treating so poorly is Colonel Samuel Rivers. Tell him that the pilot of this aircraft is Samuel Rivers' son. And tell him that this flight represents the first time in 15 years that my father has traveled to see me, and he's doing it to surprise me for his 80th birthday. He paused, then added quietly, and Sarah? Tell him that if he continues to treat my father with disrespect, we might encounter some unexpected turbulence that requires passengers to return to their assigned seats and remain there for the duration of the flight. Sarah smiled for the first time since boarding. I understand perfectly, Captain. As she turned to leave the cockpit, James called her name. Sarah? Thank you. For looking out for him. For seeing that he deserved better. He's your father, sir. Of course he deserves better. No, James replied, his voice thick again. He deserves better because of who he is, not because of who his son is. But I'm grateful you recognize that. Sarah walked back through the cabin with a sense of purpose she'd never felt before in 12 years of flying. She could see Marcus still standing in the aisle, gesticulating and complaining to another passenger about the delay to his work schedule. She could see Samuel sitting quietly, staring out the window, looking smaller somehow than when he'd first boarded. She approached Marcus with her professional smile firmly in place, but her eyes carrying something that made him stop talking mid-sentence. Mr. Chin, could I have a word with you privately? Marcus followed Sarah toward the galley, his expression suggesting he expected an apology for the inconvenience he'd endured. He was already preparing his complaint about the airline's failure to properly screen passengers who clearly weren't suited for first-class travel. Finally, he muttered, I assume you're going to resolve this situation? I've lost nearly an hour of productivity, and frankly, this is exactly the kind of experience that makes me consider switching to private aviation entirely. Sarah positioned herself so that their conversation would be private, but she could still keep an eye on Samuel. When she spoke, her voice was quiet, controlled, but carrying an authority that made Marcus stop his tirade mid-sentence. Mr. Chin, I need to tell you something about your seamate. Something I think you should know before we continue this flight. Marcus crossed his arms, his expression suggesting he was prepared to be unimpressed by whatever sob story she was about to share. That elderly gentleman you've been treating so poorly? His name is Colonel Samuel Rivers. He's a decorated combat veteran who served 3 tours in Vietnam and 2 in Afghanistan. He lost his leg saving wounded soldiers in a transport explosion when most men his age were already retired and playing golf. She paused, watching Marcus's expression begin to change as the implications sank in. He hasn't visited his son in 15 years because he doesn't like to travel, doesn't like to be a burden on anyone. But he flew here today, probably spent money he couldn't easily afford, to surprise someone special to him. Marcus's face was beginning to lose its color, but Sarah wasn't finished. Mr. Chin, the captain of this flight is James Rivers, Colonel Rivers' son. And today is November 23rd. Colonel Rivers' 80th birthday is Thursday. The transformation in Marcus's expression was immediate and complete. The arrogance drained away, replaced by something that looked like horror as he began to understand not just what he had done, but who he had done it to. Oh God, he whispered. I didn't. I had no idea. No, you didn't, Sarah agreed. You didn't know because you didn't ask. You didn't care enough to see him as anything more than an inconvenience. You saw an elderly man who moved slowly and needed a little consideration, and you decided that wasn't your problem. Marcus looked past her toward first class, where Samuel was still sitting quietly, unaware that his identity had been revealed. What do I do? How do I? I can't just apologize. I can't take back what I said. Sarah studied his face for a moment, trying to decide if his distress was genuine remorse or just embarrassment at being caught treating a war hero badly. Mr. Chin, Colonel Rivers doesn't know that I've spoken to you. He doesn't know that his son is the captain of this flight. He came here to surprise his son, and he would be mortified if he knew there was any drama connected to his presence on this plane. She stepped closer, her voice dropping even lower. What you're going to do is go back to your seat and treat that man with the respect he's earned. Not because his son is flying the plane, not because he's a war hero, but because he's a human being who deserves basic courtesy. You're going to offer him more space if he needs it. You're going to be kind. Marcus nodded rapidly, his earlier confidence completely evaporated. And Mr. Chin? If Colonel Rivers asks why you've changed your behavior, you're going to tell him that you realized you were being inconsiderate and you wanted to make it right. Nothing more. This is a surprise for his son, not your opportunity for redemption. I understand, Marcus said quietly. I understand completely. Sarah watched him walk back toward first class. His entire posture changed. Gone was the swagger, the entitlement, the aggressive certainty that his needs mattered more than anyone else's. He moved like a man who had just learned something about himself that he didn't like. When Marcus reached his row, Samuel looked up with the same quiet courtesy he'd shown throughout the flight. Sir, Samuel said politely, I hope my difficulties didn't cause you too much trouble. I know you have important work to do. Marcus stood there for a moment, looking down at this man who was apologizing to him for the rudeness he had received. When he spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. Colonel Rivers, sir, I owe you an apology. A profound apology. I was completely out of line, and I have no excuse for my behavior. Samuel blinked in surprise. Colonel? How did you? The flight attendant mentioned your rank, sir. I had no idea, but that's not an excuse. Rank or no rank, service or no service, I treated you terribly, and I'm ashamed of myself. Marcus began gathering his belongings from the seat. Sir, would you please allow me to switch seats with you? This aisle seat might be more comfortable for your leg, and I would consider it an honor if you'd accept. Samuel looked confused, overwhelmed by the sudden change in treatment. That's very kind, but it's not necessary. I don't want to put you out any further. Sir, Marcus said, his voice gaining strength, it would be my privilege. Please. As they switched seats, other passengers began to take notice. The woman across the aisle smiled and nodded approvingly. One of the business travelers gave Marcus a look of newfound respect. The entire atmosphere in first class had shifted from tension to something warmer, more human. Sarah watched from the galley, feeling something she rarely experienced in her job anymore. The sense that she had witnessed something genuinely meaningful. Not just a rude passenger being corrected, but a moment of real human connection, real understanding. An hour later, as the plane began its descent into Phoenix, she noticed Samuel looking out the window with an expression of excitement and nervousness that made him look decades younger. He was checking his watch, smoothing his jacket, running his hands through his gray hair. Marcus, meanwhile, had spent the remainder of the flight in quiet conversation with Samuel, learning about his service, his life, his pride in his son's career. Not pushing for details, not trying to assuage his own guilt, just listening with the respect that should have been there from the beginning. When the plane touched down in Phoenix, Sarah made an announcement that she'd never made before. Ladies and gentlemen, we've had a very special passenger with us today. Colonel Samuel Rivers, a decorated combat veteran, has flown from Denver to surprise his son for his 80th birthday. We're honored to have had you aboard, Colonel. The entire cabin erupted in applause. Passengers stood, some saluted, others simply nodded with respect. Samuel looked around in bewilderment, clearly uncomfortable with the attention but touched by the gesture. As passengers began to deplane, Marcus approached Samuel one final time. Colonel, I know I can't undo my behavior today, but I want you to know that meeting you has taught me something important about assumptions, about respect, and about the price of thinking my problems matter more than other people's dignity. Samuel shook his hand firmly. Son, we all have moments we're not proud of. What matters is what we do with the lesson. Later, Sarah learned that James Rivers had been waiting at the gate, having coordinated with ground crew to be there when his father deplaned. The reunion, she was told, involved tears, laughter, and a long embrace between a war hero and the son who had followed in his footsteps by dedicating his life to keeping people safe in the skies. Marcus Chin went on to his presentation in Phoenix, but something had changed in him during that flight. The corporate restructuring he'd planned became a company-wide initiative to hire veterans, to create opportunities for people who had served their country and deserved better than they were getting from society. He never forgot the lesson of Flight 447, that every person carries a story, every elderly passenger was once young and strong, and every moment of kindness or cruelty we choose ripples out in ways we can't predict or control. Sometimes the most important people in our lives look like the least important people in the room. Sometimes heroes wear faded jackets and lean on canes and ask for nothing more than basic human decency. Sometimes the person sitting next to you on a flight has carried wounded soldiers through enemy fire, has sacrificed pieces of himself so others could come home whole. Colonel Samuel Rivers never asked for recognition that day. He never mentioned his service, never demanded respect, never used his history to claim special treatment. He simply endured what he thought was just another reminder that the world had moved on from whatever he used to be. But his son was flying that plane. And sometimes, when we least expect it, the universe provides exactly the witness we need to remind us that heroism doesn't retire, sacrifice doesn't expire, and dignity deserves to be recognized whether we know the full story or not. The businessman who refused to move learned something that day about the cost of assumptions. The flight attendant who spoke up learned something about the power of standing out for what's right. And everyone on Flight 447 learned something about looking closer, caring more, and understanding that the person we're dismissing might be the very person who deserves our deepest respect. This story was brought to you by the Veteran's Voice. Before we leave you today, here's our question. Have you ever known someone who never asked for recognition but deserved more than anyone else? Maybe a teacher who changed your life, a neighbor who helped your family through difficult times, or a coworker who quietly carried more than their share so others could succeed. Tell us in the comments what they meant to you and how you remember their kindness. And if you think stories like this need to be heard, hit that subscribe button to support our channel. We'll see you in the next one.